and then the unity fell apart. Then we enter a period of time called the Dark Age, in which we have no written records. The Linear B script, by the way, and don't worry about Linear B now, I'll tell you this, my very first graduate paper was on a Linear B script. That's the reason I guess I'm fascinated by it. But the Linear B script ceased to be used, and for a period from 1100 to 750 BCE, we have no written records, none to speak of. So we don't know, we call this the Dark Age, because we don't know what happened during that period of time. However, it was during this time that a blind poet lived named Homer. Hi. How many of you have run into Homer in any of your literature classes before? Okay, most stuff. All right, and basically, you know, he wrote two works, the Iliad and Odyssey. And he's describing an event called the Trojan War, which was a 10-year war that occurred between the city of Troy, located here in what is today Western Turkey, and Greece. Supposedly, the war was started when Helen of Troy, who was the wife of, I believe, the king of Sparta, was raped by Paris. And this made the people of Greece very angry. So they got together armies and laid siege to the city of Troy for 10 years. And the deeds that, cover many, many hundreds of pages of Homer's Iliad. There is one event, though, that I do want to mention. During this time, there was a trooper named Achilles. Achilles' mother was so concerned that her son would grow up and be killed in war like so many of the boys were at that time. So she asked the gods to protect him, and the gods said, well, if you'll dip him in the river Styx. The river Styx was a river that the souls of the dead went to transport them to the afterlife. If you dip him in the river Styx, he'll be protected. But she held on to him by his heel, and only his heel was not submerged. The rest of his body was submerged in the river Styx. She pulled him back up, and he grew up and became a mighty warrior, and nothing could hurt him. But somebody eventually noticed that when he either stepped on a sharp stone or somehow or other, his heel would bleed. So this warrior got the brilliant idea that if I shoot a poison arrow at his heel, he'll die. So he shot a poison arrow at his heel, and Achilles died. Part of the moral of the story was something I talked about earlier, fatalism, that what will be, and we mortals simply cannot prevent it. The will of the gods has spoken, and nothing we can do can change what the gods have said. Now again, folks, let me hasten to state, I don't even pretend to believe this, but I have to teach about it because it has influenced so many millions of people throughout history. The Greeks were also a fatalistic people. Anyway, from that has come the stories about Achilles' heel. In other words, the Achilles' heel of this team is its pitching, or the Achilles' heel of this team is its front line that can't protect their quarterback. The Achilles' heel is like the weak spot that you have, that you seemingly cannot overcome. Anyway, according to the story, the people, the Greeks who were besieging Troy finally gave up. So they said, since you won, we're giving you a gift, that this big horse on wheels. So the Troy people came out, rolled this horse through the city gates, and set it in the midst of the street. And the Greeks pretended that they were leaving. They marched out of sight. All of them left, except once they got out of sight, they stopped marching and waited until dark, and dark they turned around. Inside this wooden horse were a bunch of Greek troops who, when the city was all quiet and asleep, these troops got out of the city, opened up the city gates from inside. Apparently these locks could be opened from the inside. Opened up the city gates and allowed all their fellow soldiers to come in. And they burned the city of Troy. And According to some accounts, some people escaped Troy and they went to Rome and founded the Roman Empire. Said, we're going to build up an empire that will conquer the Greeks, which they eventually did, but it took a few hundred years. Anyway, the city of Troy was no more and it was never rebuilt. The survivors either left the area or, well, they didn't rebuild it. Now, like a lot of these ancient stories, for many years we did not know what to believe about it. But then around 1793, right about the time George Washington was being sworn in as our first president, a British archaeologist discovered the city of Troy, near where the Iliad said it would be. And they found out the last time it had been lived in, it had been burned by fire. And in fact, it came to its end in a big blazing fire. Now that, folk, doesn't sanction the whole thing. Now I can tell you what a high school classmate of mine said, who's today a professor. He said, oh yeah, okay, there was a war, and they did burn the city eventually, but after time the story became stretched, and gods became involved, and supernatural events became involved. And again, he was going by what we were taught in our day. I mean, hey, folk, when I was younger, stories like Harry Potter could not have been written because all ghost stories wound up having natural explanations. It was felt like everything that dealt with the supernatural had to have a natural. And finally, late in the 1960s, up came Dark Shadows, the movie, and they did not even pretend to have natural explanations. Then eventually we opened up a little bit and became more open to the idea that we could at least mix the supernatural in fiction. Again, his attitude, not necessarily mine. The Odyssey is about the king of one of the Greek lands going home. And in the course of this travel, all of a sudden the ship is blown off course and he winds up going to various mystical places. Now, folks, if you've read the Odyssey, and apparently some of you have, the places he went to appear to be very otherworldly and mystical. But I did read a book about 25 years ago where this person said that he believed that Ulysses wound up being blown out of the Mediterranean Sea, across the Atlantic, and into South America, where again, South America, there's the Amazon River, and around the Amazon River is a race of people where the women are in charge, and the women do all the fighting, the women are the soldiers, and they dominate, called the Amazons. Said again, suppose Ulysses ran into people like this. Some of it, though, is, again, by 21st century accounts, it's hard to believe. Again, you can make up your mind for yourself how much you believe about it. But, the point I want to make, the reason to emphasize it, the Iliad and Odyssey served almost the very same purpose as did the Vedas in India, or the Bible for Christians and Jews, or the Quran for Islamic people. It served as a basis for their thought patterns. It was said that Alexander the Great never went to sleep without a copy of the Iliad. But he would read it until every night he'd read it until he got sleepy. Then he'd stick it under his pillow and went to sleep with it under his pillow, believing that somehow that would help him absorb it. The Iliad and Odyssey were written as poetry, and a lot of Greeks would memorize large sections of it. Again, they didn't have as many books as we have. So it was a type of literature that well, it set the tone for the civilization. Among the men, it told the men you should be faithful to your wives even when you're away from home. And you women must be faithful to your husbands even if he's away fighting, because it's known that a lot of times in wartime when the men go away, the women back home will not always be faithful. Or even the men, while they're far away, will sometimes lapse morally. Whereas Ulysses remained true to his wife the whole time that he was gone. Also, a whole lot had to do with courage. Courage, bravery, and a lot, of course, had to do with fatalism. What will be, and we can't do anything about it. We're helplessly at the mercy of what the gods decree. Again, this was a big part of Greek literature. It also depicted a golden age, just like China had one, a time of, a time that no longer exists, but a time that existed perhaps a few generations before. Now, the Greeks considered the Iliad and Odyssey to be serious history. They never questioned the events actually happened. Everything that was in them they had no doubts about. What about the one-eyed Cyclops monster? They never questioned it. Today's historians, again, have their doubts. All right. Greek city-states, again, they get that word polis that I've already mentioned. The polis, according to Aristotle, a great Greek philosopher came later, said the polis is the place where the Greek is born, he grows up, he dies there, he marries there, everything about his life hinges around the polis. It was like a community. He'd live in the same community all of his life, he'd fight for them, sometimes die for them. Typically in a polis, of course, you have walls, the city walls, and the outlying countryside would be where the farmers lived, and they would supply the grain and the food that the people inside the city needed to thrive on. And again, if they'd have a temple, each city-state had its own patron god. In the case of Athens, these are the most important. We're going to talk about this later, so yes, you do need to learn these names. In the case of Athens, their goddess was Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And if you go to a theater, oftentimes you'll see the statue of this really, really tall, thin woman. That's a depiction of Athena. For Corinth, their goddess was Venus, the goddess of love and fertility and of sex and everything associated with it. For Sparta, their goddess was Ares. Their god was Ares, the god of war. Each of these city-states had his own special god. So they'd have a temple to that god inside the polis. Usually the temple needed to be located on a prominent place on one edge of the polis or right smack in the center of the polis. But the citizens had unquestioned loyalty to it. Then, next thing your book talks about is a system of war called the hoplite, and the formation was called the phalanx. Now, your book shows a picture of it on page 98. Essentially, hoplite warfare, and it varied a little bit from place to place, but the idea was you never fought a Greek soldier individually. You fought the whole team. Now, to make sure that teamwork's involved, instead of having a man stand and again, now you all know by now I'm left-handed, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to pretend I'm right-handed. But the typical soldier would stand with his left hand holding his shield, protecting himself, and his right hand wielding his sword, fighting his enemy. Well, forget that. The hoplite formation, a man stuck his left hand out here to protect his buddy. Then he fought. And in the meantime, his buddy to his right was protecting him with his shield. So basically, you fought a team, but the shields were wall to wall. And again, the enemy could not really tell because the shields actually practically touched each other. And I can't help but ask, well, where did the men get the room to swing their swords with? And I can't really answer that. The shields were practically touching each other wall to wall. So if you saw them, a hoplite come after you, it would be a dreadful sight because the shields would be coming out in a straight line with the men marching in step. And that's where the army gets inside it. We still use in the 21st century. One of the things that soldiers learn, and they keep learning throughout the time in the army, march in step. Left foot first. Left, right. And they all march in step, all in a straight line, and come at you, and then they would engage. Now, in the long run, this type of fighting did keep down the number of casualties. Now, no way has ever been found to make wars safe, but it appears to have kept down the number of casualties to what less than otherwise might have been. Now, in contrast, the American Indian way of fighting, it was a way that contributed to loss. They'd get the battlefield, and they'd look around and say, who's my size? Okay, I'll pick a fight with you. And they'd fight, two of these men would fight each other, one of them subdued. Then the victor would look around and maybe pick out another man and fight with him. And, no organization, no strategy, just pick someone, maybe someone you think you beat. And if the person who wants to fight you is a little bit bigger than you are, in fact, you can always turn around and run. But no strategy, no formation, and the American Indians got conquered. Anyway, you never think of American Indians as being soldiers. What's the difference between a soldier and a non-soldier?
Discipline.
Discipline. The soldier fights as a team. You fight with one, you're fighting with them all. They're a team. The American Indians lacked soldiery, lacked discipline. I hate to say it, for those of you in Indian descent, sorry about that. But anyway, the Greeks, now, this way of fighting led to a whole lot of injuries to the throat and to the groin. And a lot of Greeks didn't like that way of fighting, but a lot of the people, though, who went into battle was hoped I'd survived. Oh yeah, you'd line up 5 deep, or 4 deep sometimes, and when the man in front was killed, the person behind would step up and take his place. And this was the way they fought. When the commanding officer saw your side was licked, or now, when it was licked, he could call a retreat. Your book shows a trumpeter, and a trumpet would give a sound. You know, there was a certain sound that meant advance, and another sound that meant pull back. And but these armies had a tendency to drift to the right, obviously, because your protection was on the right. So if your protection be on the right, you tend to want to go to your right for your own protection. So the big weakness of it was if you could outflank your enemy. This is where it first come into flanking movements. If you get around him, whether you get around his right or his left, you could whip him. They only wore protection on the front. Their backs were exposed. If you could get behind them, you could whip them. If you get around their flanks, so what they would do, they'd take their best crack troops and put on their flanks and say, you know, it was an honor to be put on the flank because your job was to guard your buddies who were doing the bulk of the fighting. Now, eventually, 2 things happened. No one person's figured out a way to defeat this formation. The Thebians did, but also this formation only worked when you had relatively small armies. When you get the Roman legions that had tens and hundreds of thousands of men, they couldn't even hear a trumpet blast above the battle noises. And this formation had to die out. But in the course of studying history of warfare, gradually and slowly, I mean, warfare evolved, but this was one stage in the evolvement of the history of warfare, and it called for discipline, organization, and I've got to quit.